fits in with the UN Convention against large-scale weather modification. The one that was passed in, I think, 1978 and ratified by the U.S. in 1980. And even if it does fit that, the reason that that convention was passed is that as soon as serious efforts began for large-scale weather modification in the 1960s and 1970s, there was an immediate fear and a kind of international panic that what you're going to see is something being weaponized. And this was seen, I think the U.S. did some stuff in the Vietnam War, climate change efforts in Southeast Asia.
Okay. And actually, I feel so guilty about having singled out Andrew for not asking his question, so I'm going to ask Andrew to ask his question as well. Just shout.
Yeah. If forgetting everything else that we could or couldn't do in global warming, should we use solar radiation management just to remove the effect of the carbon dioxide that's been emitted by the world from the start of this lecture? Just that on its own, should we do that in isolation? And if we don't, if somebody else did it, should we ask them to stop?
Okay, that is a great question. I'm going to stop. I'm glad you asked. I'm going to ask people to come back to whichever of those questions they choose. I might prod a little bit, and also to sum up as they do so, since we're trespassing on the time of the audiovisual people, among others. Dan.
Well, I actually think that last question is a very interesting question. Let me phrase it a slightly different way. Suppose we actually decide that air pollution matters, and we're going to try to dramatically reduce sulfur emissions from coal burning, which, by the way, we need to stop anyway because we need to stop burning coal. But let's suppose we do that. We're going to potentially, if climate sensitivity is higher than we think, and the effect of sulfate aerosols is higher than we think, it's on the high end of the errors, of the uncertainty, we might see a dramatic warming for that reduction in sulfur emissions from the troposphere.
And ship tracks too.
Yeah. Currently, sulfur in ship fuel is a big thing. Coal is really big. And so you could imagine, what about an alternative proposal that said, you know what, let's just trade off, as we reduce sulfur in the troposphere, let's trade off a tiny amount of sulfur in the stratosphere, just so that we don't actually lose ground on the climate, because we could experience a dramatic warming from trying to reduce sulfur emission pollution. Does that seem a little more palatable to people? You know, basically replacing pollution we're already doing, reflecting sunlight, with an equivalent amount of stratospheric pollution, except a much tinier amount for health.
Exactly. So
much tinier amount, by a factor of 10 or 20 or something. So that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I think it's an interesting thought question. I want to leave, though, with one really important thing that's depressing. But I've taught a course for many years. I know at least one of my students is in the room, where you try to actually calculate what a low carbon economy looks like. And I've done it for the world, but just take the US for a second. Just try to do it for the US, making incredibly aggressive assumptions about energy efficiency. And the answer is that with perfect economics, perfect politics, perfect technology, all the political will to decarbonize, at current rates of construction of electricity plants, because the general strategy is to electrify things and then decarbonize the electricity, we're talking about something like 250 years. Now, you could accelerate that. If we built things at the rate of China, it might only take 75 years. So the idea that we can decarbonize quickly, I would just say it's not impossible. I can't tell you that it's technically impossible, but if you look at the rates of industrial requirements and the rates of construction of hardware, it's not like giving up smoking. It's not like some of the other things we're dealing with. We're talking about infrastructure requirements that are massive, and the timescale is, at China's rates of construction, close to 100 years. At our current rates of construction, 200 to 300 years. That means that climate change is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And this moral hazard issue, to me, you know, frankly, we got to push for reducing CO2 emissions, but we're going to put a lot more CO2. The world's going to put a lot more CO2 in the world, and we better figure out what we're going to do about it.
And is that also, in effect, your answer to the question about intermediate timescales and about political action?
Yeah, that's right.
Alan.
I'd just like to answer the question about ENMOD, the Environmental Modification Treaty, and weaponizing this. On my original list of 20 reasons why it might be a bad idea, those were two of them. One is that it would violate the UN Treaty on hostile environmental modification, and the other is that they could be used as weapons if you develop the technology. Jim Fleming, professor at Colby College, has a great book called Fixing the Sky, which has the long sordid history of weather and climate modification in the world and in this country. It's been attempted for a long, long time. But our research doesn't violate any of this because the ENMOD has to do with actually implementing it, not studying it. Now, there is an issue with small-scale outdoor experiments. What governance do we have about somebody flying a plane up and spraying some stuff out and seeing what effect it would have, or brightening clouds over the ocean? There really is no governance about that. On what scale should it be allowed? Should there be, as David said, red and blue teams, should there be separate people that are evaluating these things? There is no such governance. That's one of the things that has to be built, some way to regulate even small-scale experiments, let alone implementation. ENMOD has never actually been used, and so there's a lot of other international conventions that could be considered, but there's a nice appendix in the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative report about that. So it's not clear it would work if somebody tried to say, what you're doing is hostile to me because it's ruining my crops. It's not clear how well it would work, but it is there and it's something to consider. Intent matters, yeah. How do you know what intent is?
And Alan, while I've got you, I just want to